Okay, welcome back everybody to Big Data Days 2023. This is track 2. I'm your host here, John. And for this session, we are very fortunate to have another John with us, John Mousa, who is the Senior Solution Architect for AWS, one of my favorite cloud provider. Right, John, today I believe your topic is to talk about silos to data-driven culture. And it is a modern data strategy model you're trying to explain to us. So, John, over to you.
So, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. When we usually talk about a data strategy moving forward, there are a lot of hurdles that come across our way. One of them can be technology. Some of them can be attributed to culture. Today, we're going to try to unpack that, but not just from a strategic kind of conversation view, but we are also going to touch how or what that would mean for our architectures and what that would mean for our services and technical implementations that we would have. So maybe then first, I would tell you a little bit that I'm John. I'm a senior solutions architect at AWS, currently working with digital native businesses, but I come from a background of building microservices, enterprise integration systems, and I've been working with enterprise customers before moving to the digital native businesses. And since I joined AWS, I've been specializing in analytics, currently advising customers on their data strategy. Just maybe the first questions that we can have in the poll, have any of you checked out the presentations that I did last year, or checked the presentations I did yesterday on Devox, if you were by any chance here in Brussels? Maybe, John, that can be our first question.
Yes, John, I've actually put up the poll. I'm just giving...
Don't try to take a screenshot of the QR code. I'm going to provide you with the slides at the end of the presentation, so don't bother yourself with that. Right?
No worries. I can actually show the results. Let's give another minute or two to our audience to so-called feedback and on the poll. Right, guys, I'm going to give you another 5 more seconds, and I'm going to close the poll, and then we can show the results to everyone. So here we are. So it seems that quite a number of us are not aware of it, John. So,
right.
Yeah.
Cool. So we will do a recap over it, don't worry. But it's also worthwhile to check the full session because you're going to get a lot more context and a lot more details about what we are going to present, right? But anyway, I'm going to do a quick recap. But then when we're talking about data strategy and we try to do a survey for executives, and here we don't really mean just high-level executives, but we're also looking at organizations that had established a data practice at them, and they have a CDO, and we're being asked whether they were successful with their data strategy or not. And almost every organization would say that they want to be data-driven. But the good news is 60% or almost 60% of the organizations are saying that they have had some success with their data strategy. And this number keeps growing year over year. Every time this survey is being run, this number keeps growing. So there is a great hope for running successful data strategies. But then the second question that's being asked to participants is that whether they think it's people or culture or process that presents the biggest challenge for the data strategy, or on the other hand, whether it's technology. And I think we touched a little bit on that session in the last panel discussion, but I'm going to actually also ask you your opinion, whether it's people or technology. And that can be our second poll question.
John, I've just started the poll. Hopefully we will get some response from our audience as well. Let's give them a few more seconds to make the selection on the poll.
Yes. This is like a binary question, so you have to make up your mind. Is it people or technology?
Ooh, it's actually quite a tough one. I can see that.
Yeah.
Right? People or technology. It's mini, minor, minimal. So which is a better answer? Right, okay, let me show the results to everybody. I think the majority of our audience have actually chosen people.
Right.
over the technology. So that's an interesting choice, John.
Yes,
Very interesting.
definitely. Right.
Yeah.
Because this actually aligns with what executives are saying, right? They're saying that in most of the cases, it's actually the people. I wasn't satisfied with that answer. So, what we are going to do is that we're going to try to dive deeper a little bit in that problem. So, first, let's meet those people. In our organization, we usually have one interesting stakeholder, which is Buzz from business. Buzz represents for us the data literate communities, but also represents one of the most famous stakeholders, which is a business analyst that we would have in any line of business or our teams. He's usually trying to take strategic decisions for our teams, moving us towards a successful product or a successful line of business, or identifying what is the things that needs to change on a very high level. Buzz looks at the data from the lens of analytic or business intelligence tools, and that for him represents aggregates of data. He's not really interested in the low granularity of data, but rather how are certain products or our services doing at a high level in certain geos or demographics per customers, right? He might do some slicing and dicing, right? So he might just sub-aggregate the numbers, but that doesn't go to the deepest level of details for our data. He also might run some what-if analysis, but again, he's not really interested into what every record means in our data stores. On the other hand, we have Tony. Tony is a data architect. He represents a tech wizard in our organization. Tony is building data platforms that are powering those experiences for Buzz. And when he's not busy helping Buzz, he's helping other teams building digital experiences that are data-driven. Think of those, for example, as services that go directly to your end customers that tells them this is your next best action, or this is the recommendation about the next things that you can buy or consume from our business. But at the middle of this experience is Barbara. Barbara is relatively new to the conversation. However, she represents our organization's ambitions to not only look at the past and understand what happens, but also look in the future and try to do some predictive analytics based on the data that is there. And Barbara looks at the data with a different lens and a different set of tools. She uses notebooks to try to build stories, but also when she would want to productionalize her predictive analytics, she would want then to start using ML ops tools to productionalize those predictive insights. But Barbara looks at the data from a very different lens from what Buzz does. And where Buzz is looking at aggregates, Barbara wants to discover patterns in the data. And if she has a narrow context of data, those patterns are going to be very trivial. She simply wants to integrate data to create a bigger context. So for example, when Buzz asks Barbara and says, hey, Barbara, I would want to know whether we're going to have a problem with our free cash flow for the next 2 financial quarters. Barbara then would say, okay, so how do I do that? Buzz would say, you know what, I have just a list of invoices, and I know that you like working with spreadsheets, so I'm going to do an extract of our database and give you a spreadsheet, right? That's a typical story that Barbara has every day. Barbara looks at the spreadsheet and she's not really satisfied. What she really wants is that she wants to know not only invoices, but also how are the payees doing on terms of their financial statements. What are the ambient economic situations that's happening? And in that context of data, now she can predict patterns where the organization might have a problem with free cash flow. On top of that, she doesn't only want to discover patterns, she wants to make sure that those patterns are repeatable. So she wants to look at a history of data. That's very different from what Buzz is looking at. Now, Tony overhears this conversation and knows that Barbara is dissatisfied with the data sets that Buzz gave her, so he tells her, I have a plan. I've been building a system for Buzz, so maybe that can help you out. And so Tony does what he does, and he onboards Barbara to the to the data platform that has been powering business intelligence experiences for Buzz. Barbara looks at the data and says, Tony, I need to onboard some more data sources. So she tells him, please onboard those data sources. Now, Tony is starting to get, oh, that's going to take me a lot of time. And Tony feels now the pressure to try to build all these ingestion pipelines. First, he has an ingestion pipeline. Then, even if he manages to get the data on the data platforms that he has that was powering the experience for Buzz, he tells Barbara, all right, I'm ready, just check the data. Now, Barbara looks at the data. They have been modeled from the perspective of Buzz. And I don't know about you, but I've never seen a data scientist that comes every morning excited to say, today I'm going to join 2 fact tables with 20 dimension tables. So I'm super excited. I'm going to be like doing a lot of stuff today. Well, what she wants to look at is just integrated data. She doesn't really care about how they were modeled for Buzz. So again, that's a consumption problem for our platform. So Barbara, being a very smart person, and she has a powerful computation tool at her hand, a notebook, she actually gets the data from the sources in the ways that she would just like access the data, away from the data platforms that was built. Tony now realizes that he has a problem. His data platform was bypassed, so Tony becomes sad. Barbara has now a new problem, that the data that she's getting from those data sources is not aligned with how the data was modeled inside the data platform. So it's not aligned with the analytics experience that Buzz is getting. Simply, this can represent itself as numbers that, if aggregated, would not look like the same numbers that are represented on a dashboard that our business users are saying. Hence, Buzz doesn't trust the data and doesn't trust the predictive insights that Barbara provides. And now he calls that Barbara is providing questionable insights. Barbara becomes sad because her experiences are not useful anymore. And then finally, Buzz is sad because the experience that he's been asking for is now taking weeks, if not months, to try to realize. And he thinks that he's questioning now the benefit of this data platform or data strategies that he has. If we try to align this journey with what our organization is having, we can look at a very simple or rudimentary representation of our organization. First, we can look at 2 business domains. Please don't consider them as data-driven domains or anything like that. These are basically lines of businesses or functions, but anything that you can draw a context around and say that they have some kind of a local problems that you're trying to solve. And at the initial step, our business domains would have obvious analytic insights that they want to get. For example, a marketing domain would be interested, as we mentioned, to know about what products are doing good in certain geographical areas. And then they would try to see or line up the best products for our business analysts to double down on those products with marketing strategies. They might also want to know better about our customers, what's their preferences for buying certain things. On the other hand, we can look at a back office domain, which is if we have a customer and decides to take a service from us or buy a product from us, how are we going to fulfill this actual order for them? And their concern is mostly, how do I optimize this experience in terms of providing a better quality for the users, but also how can I bring down the cost of bringing a per unit item for our users? This will drive down the cost generally for the marketing team. But these are 2 local concerns. And in this stage, we can find Tony building data silos for Buzz. And that's okay if that serves the ambitions of our organization at this stage. However, we discussed that at this stage, there is some kind of problems that we have, which is data ingestion problems. At the next stage, our organization would bring in Barbara and other team members who would want also to look at the data. And because they want to look at the data from a different lens, now we have a consumption problem. And that's the burden of consumption that goes into the next stage of an evolution of our data strategy. And that's what we're going to call the functional stage, extending the analytics to multiple roles within our organization. But then comes something that's called the differentiating integration value, which is our organization realizes that it has been running the data in silos for some time, but integrating the data together from two different silos, from the front office and the back office domains, can bring for us a unique value that would set us apart from our competition. I'm going to give you an example. If you look at an Amazon.com page, when you're buying a product, you see at the front page some product, and hopefully this product reached you because you searched for it or it was recommended for you and you liked the recommendation. That's a marketing team working. But then when you decide to buy the product, or a key factor for you to decide actually to buy the product is something that you can see on the right of the page that tells you if you buy this product by this certain amount of time, then you're going to get it delivered to your address at this time. That's an estimation and a prediction that was made from the back office operations. But it's not a simple estimation. It takes into account your address, your location in terms of last mile delivery, and a lot of other things about logistics of the product, where it is on a certain data warehouse, how it's going to be fulfilled from a certain seller. But it takes into account things that it knows about you as a customer, how important you are, for example, as a Prime member or not, and also things like where this product is located. Those kind of things combined together would provide this differentiating integration value. There are a lot of other examples, like, for example, a unified search experience in your organization, or maybe something like fraud detection that would take into account your profile plus the transactions that you have been doing in order to define whether a certain transaction is fraudulent or not. We aligned those steps on this model and said that initially we have this initial ingestion problems and the functional problems and going data-driven, and we want to reach a step of being continuously innovative. This step would allow us to actually run multiple experiments. Through those multiple experiments, we can determine what's working for our organization or not. And the only way we can be innovative is by running multiple experiments and cut the ones that do not work short early on. And so we align those to actually our problems of like removing ingestion burden, and we explained in the sessions that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that we are going to use techniques like command query responsibility segregation to ease the ingestion burden. That's a pattern that allows you to have two different ways to look at the data. One way that is aligned to the operational ways that you access the data, but also you can have a different view from the data that's analytical in nature and helps you not only build better APIs for your services, but also serve your business intelligence tooling. In the next step, we discussed how we can layer the data, and we're going to have a recap on this because that's important for our session, in order to provide a better consumption experiences and have multiple consumption experiences built on the same data. And then in the last step, we discussed how we can scale through distributed patterns to provide a marketplace of data. But the most important thing is that we layered those decisions or those architectures on top of each other in an evolutionary architecture kind of view. So let's get started then and start talking about what are the technical implications and things that we need to have at our initial step. We mentioned ingesting data, and the very first things that you need to have in order to ingest data efficiently is a safe data landing zone. That includes things like not just protecting your data syntactically, but also protecting your data logically. Syntactically, you can encrypt the data in transit or at rest, but logically, you also want to provide granular access controls for data access. But it's not just about protection, it's also about understanding and having visibility in terms of what happened when people access the data, and then identifying if there are some risks. So audit controls becomes important. Finally, if you can inherit those controls, if you can automate those controls multiple times, so you can inherit those controls every time you create a data landing zone, then you would not need to care about human errors or people mishandling your data every time they create a data landing zone. At AWS, there are multiple services that can enable you to do this kind of security landscape for your data landing zone. You don't have, I'm not going to explain all those services. I'm just putting them there just for you to note them down later and check out for them. But what I really would want you to look at is things that are related to data protection specifically, where you can actually use machine learning to identify patterns in your data, like PII data patterns, and then identify that this data needs a special form of protection, for example, for your organization. Let's jump a little bit into technology, right? Because there is a build effort associated to trying to reduce the ingestion burden from your data sources. And we mentioned that we want to push left. We want to, in our previous presentations, that we would want to put that at actually the responsibility of people building services in your organization. So at the very first step, you can do command query responsibility segregation as a pattern where people would build those things inside their services, and you can ingest the data from there. But you can also use some of the things to enable you to go more in an aided way. Like, for example, Amazon DynamoDB, NoSQL database at AWS, provides you a way to stream data directly from it as events using DynamoDB streams. But if you have other relational databases, you can hook up AWS Database Migration Service to those relational databases, or also some other NoSQL databases. And again, provides this event stream directly. This event stream that's from your operational data source can provide you a way to construct another analytical view out of your data without touching the operational data store itself. Moving forward, you can actually use data adapters that would enable you to get this analytical data out of your operational data store. For example, Amazon AppFlow allows you to just plug into any software as a service that you might have, like, I don't know, Salesforce or SAP, and then get the data analytically through APIs that those systems provide without touching their data sources themselves. Finally, you can also not even move the data. So for example, Amazon Aurora, which is our flavor of relational databases, can provide you techniques that's called zero ETL, which moves the data automatically to your Amazon Redshift, which is your modern data warehouse in the cloud. Or you can use something like Amazon Athena, which is a big data querying service. And through connectors, you can just federate access to different data sources without also, again, moving the data outside of those data sources. So this is something that comes with a low burden. But again, it comes with some kind of caveat that those data in those data sources were modeled operationally. So be very careful about just grabbing the data from there and make sure that it works out for you analytically as well. All right. Till this point, John, do we have any questions regarding the initial phase? By the way, just like type questions as we go along, and we're going to have those stops in between and check for questions.
There is one interesting one. Perhaps I can project the question, John. Sure. Let me just put that up. I think the question was related to your earlier slides. It's asking how significant a role does AI play in a silo?
How
significant a role does artificial intelligence play in silo?
Yes. So artificial intelligence in a siloed mode would not be like there unless it's just aiding a silo to perform its job in its own context. But again, like artificial intelligence is something that's built on top of machine learning, right? And for it to work better, you need to know about the context, again, in data. However, let's say, for example, you have a customer experience and you have, for example, something that enables you to respond to customer calls or customer complaints. You can have a chatbot at this step, which is an AI-driven tool to allow you to respond to customer questions at this stage. But through that data, you might not have the enough capabilities to actually say, can I predict whether this customer is going to churn or not? Because have to take into account also additional stuff like customers doing operationally. Like, for example, did I deliver the last order to the customer in time?
Right.
Did they have problems through the logistics? Did they have to return the order multiple times? These are kind of things that the logistics team have information about. And in a siloed mode, either you would have to go to the silo and grab the data from there, which is sometimes expensive or infeasible, or you would have to just like make assumptions about that.
I think this is very true in that sense, because this reminds me of my past experience. I was working for a hardware vendor when I was in charge of services, and every time when the customer say, "Hey, John, I've got a problem," I'm always curious to look up, right, what was the previous state when the customer called up. And if I check the back end, we always have this smiley face or a frowning face, right, in the last few tickets that the customer have raised. And I can quickly just deep dive and say, okay, was there a warranty issue? Did we deliver the items on site properly? Was there a customer complaint on our engineer who went and served the customer? Those kind of things. I mean, that will frame the context on how I should perhaps respond to those inquiry, or even the concerns that the customer may have raised, right? To say, hey, I'm not happy. Could you do something about it, or could you fix this for me, kind of thing. So yeah, so that's very true in that sense.
Right. Now we're moving to a functional phase where we're trying to get machine learning or data scientists and additional roles to actually start also accessing the data. We decided actually in this phase to use an architecture, and this architecture is a layered architecture. But because we're going to bring a lot of data in terms of history and also integrate a lot of data, this layer has to work out well for us. So it has to be cost effective. That's the most important thing that you need to remember about this layer. The second thing is that we need to build different consumption experiences because we have different roles. Some of them might want to look at the data from the lens of a big data framework, but some of them would want to look at the data from an analytical view, like through a data warehouse. So we're going to have multiple consumption experiences. But if there is something that we hate more than having people that have problems with consumption or people looking at alternative data sources, is that we would have to repeat multiple times to cleanse and transform the data for those consumption experiences. So what we're going to do is that we're going to introduce an intermediate layer. This is an integrated data layer, just cleansed and transformed data that has the integration semantics, like a unified ID scheme, for example, for certain entities inside them. But I cannot stress enough to make this data accessible, interoperable, and open. Because we're going to build multiple consumption experiences out of this layer. So we need to make sure that this layer can access the data and can able to build consumption experiences on top of it, right? This approach needs these kind of things that we mentioned, like it being accessible, and also we mentioned that it has to be trustworthy. So now we're going to focus on the technical implications of making this data accessible. First things that you might consider, of course, is a data catalog. A data catalog allows you to make certain data accessible. And with AWS, you have AWS Glue Data Catalog, which is at this level a technical data catalog that allows you to discover the data and allows consumers to post the data on this catalog with some technical properties attached to them. But then the consumers can now start discovering the data and start asking to use this data, right? Granting them permissions to start using this data. You can then try to extend this data catalog with additional properties that define what is a trustworthy data. And this is something that you can prove. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the properties of a data being trustworthy, but we can divide them into three categories. The first category is it being syntactically correct, right? This has to do with the accuracy of the data, right formats, whether the data is there or not, correct values or not. And then we have the timeliness of the data, which means if the data is there, does this consider the last operational transaction, or when was the last operational transaction that is related to this data? And then finally, we'd want to look at the data semantically. whether it's consistent with each other or not, whether it obeys certain data rules that we have on those data stores or not, like uniqueness of data, for example. Here, I would want to give you a models that you can think of. We start with small kind of data. Think of those as the transactions that are happening on your operational source. And then we move forward with some bigger kind of data. Those are the data that's coming in batches, and you're ingesting them through the data pipelines into your analytical systems. But finally, what if you already have a lot of data that was ingested before, and you might want to apply a new data quality rule to them? These are data that's historically been there. And for going over that spectrum, you might want to consider enforcing some of those rules through your schema, right? But that's not always the case with NoSQL databases and stuff like that. So you can actually move forward and try to use data quality jobs. Something like a library that's called DQ, which allows you to enforce a data quality rule. And you declaratively say, I want my data to be unique and to be referentially correct on certain columns, and provide some of those properties that we mentioned earlier about data quality. And then you run those jobs. And AWS Glue data quality provides you a managed way to run those jobs. And then the results of those jobs executing is something that you can add as properties to your data catalog. But what happens if the data is already there? Well, you can actually start sampling some of the data based on the data size, and then do a profile for the data, and again, run some quality jobs on top of those data to really understand the data quality of that data. And that is a very good option for data that's already there, that has not been ingested or applied data quality rules upon, that you can start now thinking about, okay, what do I do about that retroactively? Then there is a problem of data lineage. And you can consider like thinking about that with a game of telephones that we used to play as kids, where you start transforming or transporting a message from one person through the other through multiple intermediary steps. In the end, you would be surprised about the result and how different it is from the original message. And that's the same things that can happen with our data. And the ways that you can think about that is looking at how can you actually capture this data lineage. A very first step is that you can look at data pipelines and orchestration jobs that can provide you a clear view of where the data is coming from and where it's going. But if you think that those jobs are not managed and that does not provide you the sufficient view, you can actually orchestrate some agents in those jobs, like an open lineage agent. And with AWS, you can also put open lineage as a plugin on Amazon's managed Apache Airflow offering, and then use Amazon's managed Neptune, which is a graph database, as your lineage backend. Again, those are low maintainability kind of data stores. And operationally, it would be easy for you to operate. Then the next step is that you can visualize that lineage through Apache Atlas, for example, that can be run as a plugin on top of your Amazon EMR, which is a managed Spark-based environment, and also has a lot of other big data frameworks managed for you. Or you can also use Marquez, which is also an open source way of looking at the data lineage. But the most important thing is, again, considering putting those solutions together to provide like a view on the data quality, is that you can enable the consumers to actually have a good view of the data and use something like AWS Glue crawler to start discovering the data sets that are already ingested, or you can start now ingesting new data sets and catalog them as they are being ingested. Then you can look at various data quality properties attached to your data that is cataloged in your AWS Glue data catalog. And then finally, you can do transformations or additional visual pipelines on your data that you have already cataloged and made sure that they obey certain quality rules. Now, just in the interest of time, I'm going to defer questions to the end of the presentation, because I have one last part that I want to present. At this last step, we mentioned that we're going to try to scale our data platform. And when we talked about the patterns that we previously presented, which is the layered data approach, and we wanted to integrate and have this differentiating value between two separate domains. If those domains were smart and they listened to our advice previously and had those separate layers of data, now you can look at how we can integrate the data in a relatively easy way to understand from a lineage perspective, but also from quality perspective. We can actually take some of the consumable data and tell them, please build a consumable experience for us that we can take and ingest in our platform where we want to consume the data. But also, if we're running on the same technical platform, we can maybe virtualize access to the data without even moving the data around. This would enable us to build new consumable experiences out of the data integrations that we have from the previous domain of data. This might work well, this point-to-point connection, if there is a good discoverability of data and a good marketplace of data in place, that would allow us to do this kind of discoverability and assessing whether a data set is of a high quality or not. What happens if we have data of multiple domains that are everywhere in our organization? Now, there is one disclaimer first, is that before you start thinking about distributed data patterns like data mesh, I want you to actually think that this is a balancing act. It's not a default solution to your problems. Because the way that the data is being distributed this way, it means that there are strong teams that are supporting this data distribution. And this is something that was mentioned actually by Jamak Degani in her book, writing about data mesh. She was talking that the centralized data team was the last team functionally when in our organization that was at odds with the other organization, which that's her speaking about an ideal organization to start implementing data mesh. This means that the organization already embraced a distributed architecture culturally, and then looked at the data analytics platform as one of the last things that they need also to embrace this kind of distributed architecture as well. In order to look at, for example, or guide you through decisions of whether a distributed architecture would be good for you or not, we can look at something called the MIT operating model. This is an operating model that tries to say how your businesses are integrated from a business perspective, business operation perspective. And at the very first axis, looks at business integration, which means if your business units need to know about each other and what they're doing or not. On the other dimension, it's looking at a business process standardization, which means whether your businesses have to operate exactly in the same way or not. Maybe at a low part, they just need to be regulated under a certain regulation commonly. But when they are super high, it means that they need to operate exactly the same way as all the other business units. And if we move at a very high in terms of integration, which means that the business needs to know really well about other business units, but also operate in a certain way, that might be a single enterprise data warehouse kind of solution, because that's a unification kind of approach. However, if we move lower in terms of if you need to know about other businesses, then you can benefit from having a similar data platform, but then connected in terms of aggregating data. That's something like franchising. You would want every franchise to run it on its own, but then aggregate the monetary value or the revenues that they are producing at the end of the day. If you actually look at something that wouldn't really want to know about each other, but also wouldn't run in a similar way, you can think of a marketplace where people can freely put data sets on that marketplace, and other organizations would consider whether that's something that's useful for them or not. But then if your organization really wants to know about what other business units are doing, so you're really data-driven here, you can get value out of this data. So there is an integration differentiating value. but also you want to operate independently, then you can consider a distributed data pattern or a data mesh. So think about that when you're considering like what is the options for my business and whether this is the right thing or is the right pattern to adopt for my team, for my business unit, for functions that I have. Just have those considerations in mind. And there is an implication of actually running this kind of pattern within your domains. So if you have a domain and this domain is encapsulating the data or the data sources that it provides, you should have a team to support having data pipelines that would enable you to get the value out of the data through the domain, as we mentioned, the obvious domain concerns. Run multiple analytic platforms or analytical consumption experiences that would enable those people to be happy, right? But then, when someone outside of the domain would want to integrate with your data, then they need to provide a justification and say, this is why I want to integrate with your data. And you're going to have multiple of those requests. So in order to make sure that those requests are ordered in a way that provides value for the business, that has to be a product feature request. Someone says, this is why I need this, and this is the expected value of data if I get the data from you. Then you would have someone to have a new role invented in our teams that would be data products and product owner, someone who would actually prioritize those requests, put them in some kind of a backlog, and try to communicate to the internal team why we need to build this product, according, of course, to the organization. And as we mentioned, a self-service infrastructure would provide us the needs to scale this kind of thinking across multiple domains. This means that this platform doesn't really own the data. It only provides technical capabilities to different domains to start those pipelines and start building those data products. A governance board then, which is comprised out of people from the different domains. So people have to agree together. They have to come together to a board and have a regular checkup with each other to know what would be the common things that make sense to have on the different domains. Because as we mentioned, every domain has to or can operate independently, right? So here's, for example, a domain, and it's running in an encapsulated way. As we mentioned, someone would come and say, another domain says, I want to integrate with you. So they start a product feature request. But now what our domain needs to do is create for them a new consumption experience. And this is why actually a good architecture would allow us to first address the needs of our own domain, but also provide for us a way to provide external products where we can integrate with other domains. But this is actually why this layered architecture that we discussed in the functional step really is a good way to think about our data architecture, because it allows us to build those flexible consumption experiences. All right, I'm going to skip on that, but then let you know that we have actually went through a lot of capabilities. I've discussed with you a lot of things that comes starting from ingestion, security and compliance, but we did that within a story that looks at our users from the perspective of how they want to put data on our data platform, how they want to consume data from our data platform. And by putting those users and stakeholders at the center of your experiences, this is a way to make them happy. A data strategy that does not consider your stakeholders is a data strategy that's going to be a great platform, but not a lot of people are going to use. I've prepared to you a lot of resources, but you don't have to scan them or anything. But the only things that you can do is actually, if also, John, you can provide the links that I provided. This is basically a 4-click survey. So all what you need to do is just like check for whether that was a good presentation for you or not. And at the end of that survey, you're going to get a PDF resource of this presentation. And you can start checking all the resources and all the other links inside the presentation.
Yes, the link is actually shared in the chat as well for everybody who is in the audience. by my co-host, Jeremy. Jeremy have actually put it up, so click on that link in the so-called chat. By the way, John, there's a couple of questions that perhaps I can just share that. Let's start with this one. Let me just put that up. Okay, would you say that the technology behind product-focused businesses are more suited for being data-driven and scalable than services-focused businesses? I think it's quite an interesting question, John.
Yes. Yes. I think in the end, it doesn't matter because the product thinking of how you produce your internal services to your teams is not different whether you're offering services or you're offering products. In the end, that's a business kind of function. What we need to do is actually transfer a different kind of thinking to our IT capabilities to make them accessible to users. And whether you're offering services or you're offering products, you actually want to appeal to some consumers, to some stakeholders.
Agreed.
In both cases, you would want to do that. All what we want to do is just translate this kind of thinking to say that this is not just a business capability. This is also some kind of thinking that we need to have as an IT capability as well.
So I think I like the fact that one of your slides you mentioned that overall governance lifecycle that people need to be aware of across the organization. Because in my previous organization, I think we were struggling a little bit to try and formulate that big picture, because we were putting up requests. I mean, the users were requests to our team, and then we were trying to struggle to clean up the data, and then trying to make sure that we have some lineage and all that stuff, right? And we didn't have the right structure in place. I think that one slide there, I think that's absolutely critical for anybody who wants to consider this, to say that, hey guys, perhaps we should spend some time sitting down together as a team to say that how could we offer this? How could we actually better manage this? I think it's not about the technology. It's really understanding that governance model that you've mentioned. Again, that's just my view. John, what do you think?
No. It's exactly like that. We're actually looking at what would be an ideal consumption experience for a consumer. And then we can plug in technical capabilities later.
Absolutely.
But the most important thing, what is the thing that's putting a burden for our consumers to have a good consumer experience from our platform? Because otherwise, as we've seen, Barbara is very smart. All the people in our organization are very smart. Even if they have an Excel sheet, don't underestimate that. They can still get the data from different resources out there.
And if I may say, I think the technology has actually matured now. You don't need to pull data, should I say it, or grab a copy of it. I mean, there is ways that you can just link them together to all those data sources, regardless of where they are, to fit your consumption model or style that you want to do. It's different from the old days. Even I think things like your personal identifiable information, the PII, there are tools that can mask that, or should I say, cover that up so that the users don't accidentally expose that data unnecessarily. But it will still allow them to do what they need to do, to analyze, to produce a dashboard, or to have an insight as to, hey, how do we better serve our stakeholders in that sense? Yeah.
Yep. And that's the power of having those layers, right? Because in the consumable layer, and if you check also the previous presentation in the initial link, it says that this is laser-focused consumption experience. And this means that the data was filtered down already and put on those consumption experience. And the data that's not there is data that you don't need to protect. And that's a very good, interesting thing, because some of the consumption experiences don't even need to have any kind of PII data in order for them to make them valuable. And if we remove the PII data from the pipeline, even in those data stores that are in the consumption experience, that's something that reassures us that we've put another line of defense in our security in order to make sure that people don't expose accidentally data that they shouldn't.
Right. John, unfortunately, it's we're running out of time already. I thoroughly love the way that you actually explain that in the story, and actually focus on that big picture thing, on how we should actually better serve our customer. And like I said, AWS has always been one of my favorite cloud provider, because I think the tools are absolutely just brilliant. It helps you to pull that data as and when you need it. I think with all the different products that you've just briefly touched on, I think that's fantastic, guys. So if you need to have further questions, do reach out to John Mousa on LinkedIn, and hopefully he can actually help you out a little bit more post the conference in that sense. Again, John, thank you so much. We'll hope to see you again the next time around.
You've been a great host. Thanks a lot, John, and thanks to all the audience for coming.
Thank you, everybody. All right, we'll catch up, everybody, again. Just to let everybody know, we do have the next session ongoing. It's actually on screen now. Track 1, Susanna is actually going to be sharing organizational culture transformation, and Henry is going to talk a little bit more on hybrid cloud for the big data. Ooh, both interesting topics. So hang around and please join the next session, guys. All right, see you, everybody. Bye. Take care.